Some would say New York is the cultural capital of the world. It's no doubt a city of great art, the birthplace of modernism, and it's certainly a magnet for eccentricity. Some decades ago, out of Gotham's urban canyon, there emerged a rare bird, and her song startled even the less discerning among us. Florence Foster Jenkins. Even so long after her death, her recordings, remarkable testimonials of her particular art, still outsell those of many more celebrated vocalists. My acquaintance with Madame Jenkins began in 1944, when I learned she would give a recital at Carnegie Hall, no less. I asked her for an interview, and she consented. The hotel where she resided doesn't look anything like what it did in those days, but there still might be some connection.
Yes, I am a New Yorker, my background being Holland, Dutch, and English. But I have lived here almost all my life. Will you take tea, Mr. Key, or would you like a drink? Oh, how kind of you to write about me. Now then, my club of 800 members was built up during the war when I was working for the Red Cross, you know. Many of my friends said that I could do so much more for music if a club were formed. Now, Maestro Carlo Edwards, do you know him? He's a conductor at the Metropolitan Opera. He had been coaching me in the aria Pace, Pace, mio Dio by my beloved Giuseppe Verdi. And Maestro asked me, of which club are you president? And I replied, well, of the Verdi Club. And the Verdi Club was born. Oh, music means so much to me. Please have some of the sandwiches. Now then, how can I help you? But first tell me, how did you hear about my recital?
It was in the paper.
Oh, which one? The journal? Oh, I didn't see that one yet. I do hope they got the date and the time correct. Have you heard me before?
I've not yet had the pleasure, but I've heard so much about you.
Oh.
She was the world's worst singer and didn't realize it.
She said, I want to do this, I have the money now to do it, and I'm gonna do it.
She was a monster of vanity.
She wanted to be a famous singer, and she is a famous singer.
She never gave up.
If Florence did it, I can do it too.
She looked almost like a drag queen.
She was quite busty.
No intonation, no musical talent.
She was terrible. And it's a damn good story. It's unbelievable, but it's true. There's something about Florence Foster Jenkins singing that's funny, and it's difficult to put your finger on exactly what it is. I love the fact that Florence Foster Jenkins introduced into the world of music a sense of humor She didn't mean to do that, but she's dead and it doesn't matter. I treasure her records because they make me smile.
I think it was a shock of disbelief that someone could sing like this, but I got over the shock very quickly, and even over the fun element very quickly, and was drawn into something that went way beyond just funny opera, just funny sounds. There was a tragedy that I heard, something that was immediately evident that there was more to her than just a funny joke.
She was a woman who thought that she was an excellent opera singer who was not, according to her audience. However, she was very devoted to her art and to her audience, and she felt that she was instrumental in bringing art to the world and that was important. And if she was giving people joy, and if she was enlightening them, and if they were spending an evening with music and tableau vivant and poetry and dance, what better way to spend your life's time?
These tableaux vivants of hers were the talk of the town, but I always wondered how she truly conceived of herself.
Obviously, she didn't hear her own voice the way other people heard it. She is on record of having bragged that her high notes were better than Gala Corchi's or Frida Hempel's or the other great coloratura sopranos of her day. So the realms of self-delusion that she dwelt in went far beyond just the sound of her voice singing off pitch.
She gets up there and sings her arias because she believes in herself that she is the greatest soprano of all time. It's a delusion, but it's a fascinating delusion. I mean, it's like Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, who still thinks she is the greatest living diva of all time, and she doesn't get that the world's laughing at her. And that's why I think people are fascinated with Norma Desmond and with Florence Foster Jenkins.
Great singers have told you that they don't, what you hear is not what they hear. They hear something different going on in their minds. So it's possible that she thought that what she was hearing was not what you were hearing. And what she was hearing was pure and correct and of very high caliber.
So tell me, Mr. Key, are you a newspaper man?
No, Madam Jenkins, a music lover.
Oh, very well. Would you like some sherry?
Would you join me? I mean, madam, do you drink? Liquor, that is.
Does a fish swim? Do you love opera, Mr. Key? I think it's wonderful that young people today are so interested in my music. So you are a musician then? My husband and I are always tremendously interested in young musicians. Some of those we've helped have gone on to very promising careers. I'm sure you'll hear of them in the future. But now we have wasted entirely enough time on others, Mr. Key. I do believe you asked to interview me.
Do forgive me, Madam Jenkins. Yes, about your concert at Carnegie Hall next week.
Well, you are, of course, attending.
I wished, but how might I obtain tickets?
I was fascinated by her Carnegie Hall plans. And wouldn't you know it, her performance was to become a smash. Not to mention a singular event in the history of the house.
When the announcement was made that she would have a recital at Carnegie Hall, the tickets sold out very quickly. And from that, you can gather that if she decided to do 2 more concerts, most likely they would have probably sold out as well. Because everyone said, you need to go hear Florence Foster Jenkins. And then after a while, there were no more tickets, you know. She considered herself a musician. And knowing the history of Carnegie Hall, it's usually most musicians' dream to appear here. It's very interesting. From the very beginning, when we established the archives in 1986, requests for information about Florence Foster Jenkins are among the top 5 requests of all time. We hear requests about Judy Garland and about the Beatles and about the Benny Goodman concert, and right there with them is Florence Foster Jenkins. She would have loved it.
If you look at the repertoire that she sang, it's gigantic.
She was in an accident in a taxi, and it made her hit a high F, the screaming from being in the taxi. And so she thought she was even a better singer than before.
It's not a self-parody. You hear that she's dead serious about it.
Fascinating. To me, it's just fascinating.
She didn't understand what she was doing. That ignorance did not stop her.
Like many artists of unusual ability, Florence Foster Jenkins has been understood by the world and even by her most devoted followers in a partial, limited sort of way. What is needed for a full appreciation is not only background of a sort, but a clear explanation of her personality by someone both familiar and sympathetic with its unusual development. It is for this reason that we are fortunate in being able to interview Mr. Cosme McMoon, who coached Madam Jenkins and accompanied her on these records.
Well, I might say that every number was memorable, the way she performed it. She added histrionics to every number, generally acting the action if it were an aria, or other appropriate action if it were a descriptive song. or else she would go into different dances during these numbers, which were extremely hilarious. There were many other unusual numbers, each one in its own costume and action.
Perhaps what's even more important, how did Madame Jenkins herself rationalize these performances?
I do think that she could not hear her own work in the proper pitch, and that's one of the characteristics of her singing. But the audience nearly always tried not to hurt her feelings by outright laughing, so they developed a convention that whenever she came to a particularly excruciating discord or something like that, where they had to laugh, they burst into these salvos of applause and whistles, and the noise was so great that they could laugh at liberty.
I wondered what was really going on here. Did she simply live blindly in a fool's paradise, encouraged by a cynical audience? And was her unique career in store for a disastrous final curtain?
She only thought of making other people happy. She gave so much happiness to the women and men who got lovely music and flowers and beautiful surroundings at the concerts that she sponsored. That's why I think it's so unkind, so unfair, all this ridicule of her.
Dearest Brownie, your poor little rumpled letter from Kansas City came this morning. I am glad you answered parts of my letter anyway, for I sent you some opera programs in which I sang, and to which you have never yet referred. I am rather a sad little bunny these days, for many reasons which I cannot relate. I am glad you are getting a chance to rest up now anyway, and this is all at present from a very lonely and homesick rabbit.
The relationship between Jenkins and St. Clair Bayfield seems to have had a sadomasochistic nature. Maybe not sexually, but certainly he was very attracted to domineering women, and boy, he had one in Florence Foster Jenkins.
She surrounds herself with men who are basically dependent on her, and she can tell them what to do rather than the other way around. For the 1930s and 40s, that is rather advanced for American society.
He was very handsome. You know, and he had this smooth British accent, I'm sure, and had an angular face, and was tall, and she wasn't. And I'm sure that she just felt very flattered to have him around. He was younger than she was, and she needed an escort, an appropriate escort to go to certain places.
He worked his fingers to the bone helping her, and he was the secret weapon that lent an air of professionalism to what she did, because she would have seemed entirely ridiculous without his input.
Your audiences love you.
Oh, yes, they do. My husband tells me after every performance how happy everyone was. I have heard some laughing after some of my performances, but it came from those hoodlums.
Which hoodlums?
The hoodlums planted in the audience by the enemies, of course.
Her voice was nothing but a squeak. People laughed heartily at her singing. I could never understand why St. Clair felt attracted to her. Naturally, he had some good times being her escort, but she stole 36 years of the best years of St. Clair's life, 14 of which I waited for him.
Toward getting as complete a picture as possible, Mr. McMoon, would you be willing to tell our listeners something about Madame Jenkins' history prior to her belated concert career?
I think I could. Madame Jenkins was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania around 1868, and of very wealthy parents. But very early she demonstrated this desire to sing, and her parents objected to the excruciating quality of her voice. Therefore, during the whole lifetime of her father, she did not sing, but she had this terrific repression.
The woman who gives a definition of what it means to be an eccentric socialite diva. That's how I would describe Florence Foster Jenkins. Before there even is such thing as called feminism, before women have the right to vote, but it's the wealth that will do it, combined with an eccentric personality. But she had to get that from somewhere. And it has to come from the streets of Wilkes-Barre, in the neighborhood that she is born and raised with, that I would probably say gives her the confidence to be the way she is. She comes from an old line family that were part of the original pioneer settlers of the Wilkes-Barre area, and a family that did very well over time. So she goes to the best church, lives on the best street, goes to the best female private school. So it would play into her later life of being a very special young lady. The young girls of her time in the neighborhood would have married the boys of the best families in this neighborhood, not Florence. She goes to Philadelphia. So she leaves town, and part of her is leaving behind, and her father tries to control her through the inheritance that she would receive and the money that she would receive at the time. But she makes up pretty well by marrying a rather rich doctor in Philadelphia as well.
Yes, Frank Jenkins. It's probably going to remain a mystery. The legend is that she married him to get away from her father. But again, there's no corroborating evidence that that's true.
Her first marriage with Frank Thornton Jenkins had been unhappy. It always surprised me that she reverted to his name, considering also that her doctor husband had given her a dose of syphilis.
She never actually mentioned Dr. Frank Jenkins, but she used his name in a very individual fashion, together with her maiden name, Florence Foster Jenkins. Although she referred to St. Clair Bayfield as her husband, they weren't actually married, and she never had any children. I remember after she died, the press was full of rumors about her estate. Eventually, it was to be divided among distant relatives, scattered across the country.
She was a first cousin to my grandfather. So if you know anything about genealogy, the next line is my mother was a first cousin once removed. And so I would be a first cousin twice removed. So the lineage goes down by generation. I would describe her as a socialite who enjoyed music and gave musicals, and I think she gave a lot of speeches. And most of her work, I think, was done for charity. And I think that she did a lot of good. I've heard her records, and I don't think she sang very well. But I do think that she enjoyed singing, and I think she gave it a try, and I commend her for that. There's a place called Find a Grave. So I leave flowers for Florence and my parents and everybody. So that's an easier way to remember someone than to go to the grave site physically.
After what was to happen, I would have reason enough to visit her rather impressive gravesite. But this anticipates my story.
She is in a spectacular mausoleum, and of course, if you look at the pecking order of how people bury themselves, if you have a little slab, you died. And if you have a tombstone, you're middle class. But when you get into obelisks and mausoleums, you're absolutely the richest of the people.
I did gain the impression that her father, who was very successful in business, in politics, was a bit of a shady character. And I think part of the reason that her mother and she wanted to get out of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, is to leave behind this odor of not quite above board political manipulation and even maybe criminal activity.
And then, of course, she moves to the center of the universe, to New York City, where then, in my mind, she recreates herself into this very eccentric socialite and diva for New York.
Father. When he died, he left her very well provided for, and her mother was a little more lenient than her father had been, so she was allowed to take singing lessons again, but not to sing in public.
He didn't leave her money outright. He left her the proceeds of property that he owned. He owned a lot of property and coal mines, and she and her mother were to share equally in the proceeds from the rent. So she didn't receive a lump sum.
We don't really know much about her finances, the extent of it, but she made the most of what she had. She didn't need to work, and she did pay her rent. But I suspect if the details were known, that one would be amazed at how far she got with not very much money.
Whatever else St. Clair Bayfield was for her, he most certainly was her private archivist. I discovered his records much later at the New York Public Library. Bayfield collected each and every mention of her and meticulously saved all in a massive scrapbook, a document of her, well, unique career.
The main vehicle for her pushing her career was the network of clubs, ladies' clubs, of which there were hundreds.
And then, of course, Florence herself started the Verdi Club to show her devotion to Giuseppe Verdi. Had a bust made for him, which has disappeared.
It was just happenstance that she called it the Verdi Club. She could have easily have called it the Tolstoy Club, but she happened to be leaning on a bust of Verdi at the time, and that's what came into her mind. She parlayed that up into a reputation as a Verdi expert, which was extremely unearned.
Her principal activity was sponsoring the musical programs of various clubs, with both work and money. The Verdi Club cost her $2,000 a year. People always wondered why she paid the members of the Verdi Club.
Part of what fueled her in doing this was her relentless pursuit of entry into a higher class of society than she was entitled to inhabit.
She had sung at small affairs in her big musical club, which was called the Verdi Club. And so great was the enthusiasm and the mirth that people clamored for more.
She used to give her biggest affair every year at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. She also gave concerts at Sherry's on Park Avenue and at the Plaza. It got bigger and bigger every year.
I've been a concert artiste in my own modest way for quite a long time. That's me in my various costumes. Well, they don't turn out very well in photos, do they? Oh, that's not me. That's my late mother, of course, Mrs. Charles Dorrance Foster. She was an artist too, a landscape painter, won many prizes for her paintings. What a wholesome old lady she was.
You were raised in an artistic environment.
Oh, like all young girls my age, I was taught the piano and taught to be a lady of leisure. But I always maintained that if you desired something strongly enough and worked assiduously toward that goal, you will one day succeed. From little acorns, great oak trees grow, Mr. Key. You see, my parents were very strict, and they thought that a stage career wasn't suitable for a lady of my social standing. I, however, believe in a certain relaxation of such strictures these days. After all, these are modern times.
You are very liberal-minded.
Oh, but of course I would never dream of taking part in something so lacking in taste as those dreadful Broadway shows which the public raves about. Opera has always been respectable. Would you like another sherry?
The modern aspect of Florence Foster Jenkins in the 1920s is that she does eccentric things, and that's very typical of what you get in New York at the same time. So in this atmosphere when people crave for something sort of new, something that wasn't traditional and old-fashioned. So maybe you could see her as part of the modernist movement, liberation movement. That is something I think very typical of that period also, of the 1930s.
Electro, come here. Stop.
Certainly New York was one of the most advanced and had the most, certainly had the energy, had energy and drive more than the old world, Paris and Berlin. So you took some pride in the fact that you were a New Yorker. It's a great kind of potpourri of so many different cultures coming together and blending or not blending or clashing, and out of that comes great art.
She loved to have people look at her. She wore fantastic outfits that had no relationship to anything anybody else ever wore anywhere. In the beginning of her career, she used to disport herself, despite the fact that she was an ungainly and ugly woman, in tableaux vivants in which she impersonated great heroines in history. And it's a little embarrassing to think of now, but it happened.
Actually, I never, ever thought it was bad taste. I always thought, even before I knew anything else about her, what a sweet old lady in this funny costume. Why is she wearing this?
Well, some people have wondered if it was performance art, what she was doing. If she had a keen understanding of what she was doing.
It was camp, but it was high camp, and that's what she is high camp, you see. So see, there's good camp and there's bad camp, and she was good camp because she really believed in it and what she was doing.
There is an essay by Susan Sontag called Essay on Camp. In that essay from the 1960s, she describes that great camp art is only great if it takes itself seriously. So if you think it's funny what you're doing, the effect is not going to be the same as when you're totally convinced that this is the real thing. And I think Florence Foster Jenkins is a perfect example of someone who is an exponent of camp art without wanting to be camp.
What is interesting to me is that she was also very ill. You know, she had syphilis, and who knows how that affected her mind, you know? So that's very possible. She might not have been mad, but she was certainly not healthy.
Well, there's the story that she had syphilis. And certainly there's evidence that that's true. Clair Bayfield says that Mr. Jenkins gave her a dose of syphilis. Clair Bayfield hated Florence Foster Jenkins. And it's quite possible that Kay made that story up.
I mean, there's so many things she could say for revenge. I think there has to be some truth in it. Because literally, she could have said anything. She could have said she has flat feet, or you know, she could have said that that she had no money, or that you know, that people laughed at her, you know, which she did, but she didn't. She mentioned this very interesting, specifically about syphilis, not other venereal diseases, but she doesn't say it with any compassion.
When I read that she contracted syphilis from her husband, her first husband, I was quite fascinated by this because basically it's a very tragic thing to happen, especially at that time when the treatment for syphilis was complicated and you lose your hair. It can blacken your teeth, as it did with Oscar Wilde, for example, or Ludwig II, King of Bavaria. So it was not an easy thing to get over with. Some people claim that her tone deafness and her lack of rhythm were caused by the syphilis. But I think maybe it went beyond that, that this dementia that she had in a way, or that she portrayed on stage, was caused by the illness.
She really didn't hear the atrocious pitches in these things. She used to sit delightedly and listen for hours to her recordings.
To my own darling Brownie. So many years ago when we met at the Waldorf, at the Musicale on that snowy evening where I was wearing my violet velvet gown, I saw your smile in the audience from my place upon the stage. In the terribly dark and tragic years which just followed our meeting, I do not think I could have lived without that smile. You comforted me in my grief and helped me build my new life. In my singing, in my club work, in the difficulties of relationships with unpleasant people, your unfailing tact and good judgment have meant everything. Forever yours, Florencia.
They had pet names for each other, but the impression is rather more like a comfortable old shoe rather than a passionate lover.
Well, love comes in degrees, doesn't it? They certainly cared for one another. And maybe there were levels of professional caring. But he didn't give up on her for over 30 years. Whether it was a love story or not, I don't know. I can only imagine there was a lot of unspoken expectation between the two of them.
Florence Foster Jenkins was extremely selfish, but a colourful personality. I think St. Clair got hooked because he was lonely, and naturally, he was a great asset to her. She was fond of him in her selfish, American way. But also liked the admiration of other men.
One of the most fascinating things I found in doing research about her was the sexual hijinks that she and her little circle was involved with. And there's a delicious story where St. Clair Bayfield had started a sexual affair with Kay Bayfield, and they were in this little crappy apartment that Florence paid for St. Clair doing it, and then Florence showed up.
Quickly, he told me to get into the closet. She came in, and he spied my green shoes under the bed, but he stood in front of them. She only stayed for 5 minutes, but it was the worst I've ever experienced. For him, it would have been agony if she found out, though he always said she was a psychic.
in a sliver of a particular type of an American woman, coming from a background where she can learn that she's associated with people who are movers and shakers, but then inherits money, she doesn't really need men.
Look at her name. We know her as Florence Foster Jenkins. We do not know her as Mrs. John Thornton Jenkins. That, and it's hard for many people now to understand that. But at that time, that was a political statement for a woman to go by her first name, to have a name in public. I do think it is a feminist story. I think that Florence Foster Jenkins may have been a feminist.
A woman getting ahead in a man's world in the 1920s and 1930s is notable, but I don't think she cared very much about other women. And to be a feminist, I think you have to represent a cause that goes beyond your own ego and vanity. And I don't think she was really interested in other women, other women's rights, other women's progress. I think she was interested in herself.
She was doing her own thing. She was self-determined in what she wanted to do. And I think in that way, she is really a great feminist role model. Plus that she seems to have operated in a world, or in a private world, where there were a lot of women friends, you know, from all the clubs that she was in. So it was a world where she has chucked out all the aggressive male men like her father and her husband, first husband, and she lives somewhere where she reigns supreme and where she can do what she wants. And I think that's what makes her so much more interesting.
Florence Foster Jenkins liked Manhattans and sandwiches. She wore rings on every finger, even on her thumb. Her gestures and expressions were just as funny as her singing, but there was a coldness in her eyes.
My dearest Duchess, the check came safely to my hand. Many, many thanks. I know you had a wonderful concert tour. You have expressed yourself as if I was with you when you're singing. I am, dear, and it has pleased me greatly, for I felt that one so highly tuned must get my vibrations. With Ocean of Love, your loving baby doll. I'll be with you, darling.
Not only did St. Clair have an active sexual life behind her back, but she had an active sexual life with others, unspecified others at the same time. And there's this fascinating letter that turned up from an unknown lover. So in a way, this makes me feel good about Florence Foster Jenkins. The old lady had a lot of vitality. The company that made her records, Melotone Records, was a kind of a vanity recording outfit. And Melotone made records to order for money. The reason they were made is because of Florence's vanity. She thought that her art should be memorialized. But she didn't really have any idea about how a record company worked. The woman who ran the company gave an interview in which she told the story of how Madam Jenkins called her and asked if she thought maybe they should redo one of the records because there was one note she thought that wasn't absolutely perfect. And the woman told Jenkins, "Oh no, there's nothing you could do to improve these records. These are absolutely perfect." And that satisfied Jenkins, and it's very difficult to tell which note it is on that record that bothered her.
I have made quite a number of recordings, you know. The demand has been so great that I've been forced to continue. I go to that little recording studio on Central Park West. Such kind people. At first, they were surprised that I would record a single song just once. But I think if you don't get it correct on the first time, you can't possibly do it any better on the second. So I don't find recording anywhere near the trial most singers do.
I've heard some of your records. I found them really extraordinary.
How kind you are. Which one is your favorite?
Like a bird I am singing.
Flatterer. You're just saying that because, of course, you know I wrote the poem. But I do think it was set to music quite beautifully and with great sensitivity for the particular capacities of my voice.
Would you say, Madam Jenkins, that an operatic voice is not just a gift, but can be also acquired by hard work?
A voice must be discovered. A voice of beauty is a joy forever. And all can learn to sing through marvelous discovery. But you must pay attention to the true facts of your voice and your possibilities.
It's a delicate question whether anyone told her the truth. Certainly St. Clair Bayfield didn't. After she died in an interview, he regretted that he didn't. I don't know. I mean, if you had a batty old aunt who insisted on singing before the public, would you tell her that she had no talent? It's a very delicate thing.
Can I ask your expertise as a vocalist, Madam Jenkins?
By all means.
I overheard occasionally that there are some singers who hear their own voice in a different way than the audience does. I wonder if this is true and what the difference could be.
What in the world are you suggesting?
I mean, would it be possible that some singers' consciousness of the own voice is rather imaginary?
Why on earth would a singer imagine their own voice and hear something entirely different than the public? You would do well to forget such a preposterous theory, young man.
Yes, of course, madam. Silly of me to suggest such a thing.
Indeed. I think I'll take a little break now.
She never trusted anybody. She didn't even trust herself.
But she talked about trusting God.
I'm not so sure that was very sincere.
Well, she thought she was God herself, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Joy of the morning, the river is flowing, there's a silvery wave on the crystalline bay, to the notes of your flute, the shady groves yearning. My thoughts of you bring me sweet memories thrilling.
bring a vision so pleasant, the smile that is thine. Inspiration comes near when your music is heard. In fondest endeavor, you sing like a bird.
Like a bird, I am singing
Up above on the wing, like a bird, like a
I didn't know you were... You look...
I plan on wearing it for the second half of the performance. I thought you might appreciate a sneak peek. But of course there will be added accessories for the performance.
It certainly will stun the audience. Did you design this on your own?
I design almost all my dresses, silly. Are you married, Mr. Key?
I beg your pardon?
Are you married?
Excuse me, madam, but No, I'm not.
Oh, it's perfectly okay. Many of my friends are not married and have a great sensibility for the world of fashion. How they admire my performances. Oh, before I forget, how many tickets do you need? This will get you in, you and your friend, free of charge, naturally. But I wondered if you might do me a favor. I shall sing like a bird as an encore, and I was hoping you might bring me just a few flowers.
I certainly will, Madam Jenkins.
Living on a pittance back then, I didn't manage to buy any flowers. Burdened with a broken promise, I was stung with remorse. And all the more so, as it turned out, this most ambitious performance would also be her last.
I think the Carnegie Hall concert was the apotheosis of her vanity. She had achieved almost everything she wanted to, except to be accepted among the ranks of international performing musicians. She had remained just sort of the club lady who sang.
Certainly, Carnegie Hall had a reputation, and if she saw herself as an artist on peer with other really important artists of the time, this is where she needed to come.
You would pay Carnegie Hall the rent. and tell us what you require in terms of stage hands and ushers and security and lights, but then the rest is up to you. The interesting thing is, it was very difficult to sell out Carnegie Hall.
I was supposed to play for her that night, and when I approached the hall, I could hardly get near it because the crowd stretched all the way to the little Carnegie and around 7th Avenue, and you could hardly mill through them.
Carnegie Hall was filled to capacity. People were flourishing $20 bills to even get into the hall. She tottered onto the stage. One wondered if she'll ever make it. But she gripped the side of the grand piano and then pulled herself up and sang.
I knew what to expect. And I didn't prejudge her. There was something special about her, and she was so sincere that some of that rubbed off onto you, that you had to also respect her for the fact that she was a true believer.
It's remarkable that a woman who was making her Carnegie Hall debut, who had money, didn't document it. Really, all we do have is the program from that night and the one photo that we've seen, that's the collection of the New York Public Library. And you see in the photograph, it's not Florence Foster Jenkins, but the audience. So it all looks like they're having a wonderful time, possibly talking about what they just experienced in between change.
The concert went on with the most noisy and abandoned applause that I have never seen such a scene, either a bullfight or at the Yale Bowl after a winning touchdown. And she loved that.
The most astonishing thing about Jenkins is her vanity allowed her to react to the catcalls and the hooting and the laughing that ensued as she wrote it off. Some of it, she said, was enemies in the audience, and some of it she mistook for applause, that they loved it so much that they laughed. I mean, this is vanity taken to a demented level.
From what I remember, every time she gave a recital, there were no critics allowed. So you don't find any reviews of her concerts, you know, except for the one at Carnegie Hall.
Florence Foster Jenkins' debut recital at Carnegie Hall was one of the weirdest mass jokes New York has ever seen.
Florence Foster Jenkins' debut recital at Carnegie Hall was one of the weirdest mass jokes New York has ever seen.
Mrs. Florence Foster Jenkins can sing anything but notes.
A recital without voice.
Madam Jenkins has perfected the art of giving out its
The tones Madam Jenkins produced were tiny.
To the point of disappearing. Her singing gave us more of a kick than vodka or marijuana.
She swoops and hoots her notes like a cuckoo in its cups.
Like a cuckoo in its cups.
She hit only a few notes. The rest was promissory.
She should not have read the reviews. A lot of singers and actors tell you not to read the reviews. She made a mistake by reading the reviews, I think, and the reviews were not worthy of her because they did not understand, that they should have taken a very different line of criticism with her, not criticize her on the same as they would a Tibaldi or a Callas.
Well, it turned out the fiasco I expected. Afterwards, when we went home, Florence was upset. And when she read the reviews, crushed.
I really think perhaps she was pissed off. Because look at this feast she had given. Look at the string quartet and Cosme and me and my costumes. And you all came out in your tuxedos. Look at this feast. And you have the gall to say there was something wrong with the evening? She may have even thought, yeah, you guys can put this in print, but you get up and do it. Let me see you get up and do it.
Apparently, she went into such a depression afterwards that it led to her death. I think it was just 5 weeks later that she died.
Nobody wants to read bad reviews about themselves, whether they're crazy because of syphilis or whether they're not crazy. It's always hurtful. And especially if you go so big, like, rent Carnegie Hall and think you have a big success and then read those reviews. I think, yes, it would be shocking for anyone, certainly for her, whether that caused her death. It doesn't really matter whether that's true or not. That's the power of legends, that they inspire you to hear her differently and to look at her differently.
It is very lonely without her. But I feel I have no right to be indignant at losing someone who gave me 36 years of more happiness than most men ever know. Well, I hope I haven't told you too much. Be careful what you say. I feel so defenseless.
His grief when she died was poignant. He wept greatly. All the glamour of the past 36 years was over. No more parties, no more Verdi club. The cycle had been broken. Naturally, I was sad for him. But it meant he was free now to marry me.
Great art is also great mystery and cannot be measured by any standards except perhaps by its inimitability.
It's a part of humanity. Not everyone has a beautiful voice. So if you think about it, a woman with a not so beautiful voice still becomes famous in the world, and we will embrace that.
I think people like odd things. It must be that people can't believe that somebody can sing that badly, and willing to let other people hear them sing that badly.
In a very obscene way, it's a quintessential American story, you know, from rags to riches, or from obscurity to fame.
She loved opera so much and wanted so much to be part of it, to belong to it, that she convinced herself that she could do it.
And whether or not she was looking for perfection, that's a whole other cult of people who look for perfection in everything. And somehow that insistence on perfection kills a little bit of creativity.
I do not deny that there's a prism through which you can view her and her history and her life as something admirable, and she certainly wasn't all bad.
I think that that's what sets her apart from all her later imitators, that she brings a seriousness to this that goes way beyond what everybody else did. And she's not just some crazy, demented sort of wannabe soprano, because there's a lot of those out there on YouTube, for example, that you can hear today. She really is the real thing, and that guarantees her place in the pantheon of opera for all time.
It took quite some years to fully realize my good fortune that evening with her long ago. Florence Foster Jenkins, eccentric, pretentious, but somehow so endearing. She was, in fact, a genius of her own kind.